Crockett Johnson's classic children's book about a boy and his magical crayon is one that has enchanted readers since its publication in 1955. While there have been short films and a television series based on the book, it would take until now for there to be a big-screen film adaptation of Harold and the Purple Crayon. Attempts to get this film made at Sony Pictures actually date back to the early 90s, with Maurice Sendak initially producing it. Spike Jonze, before he eventually made, being John Malkovich, was going to direct it as a live-action animation hybrid. However, shortly before it was ready to start filming, Sony decided not to move forward on the project. There was also a period when Henry Selick was going to make it, but he chose to direct James and the Giant Peach instead. Finally, the movie came to fruition with Saldanha directing. As a great admirer of the Rio movies and Ferdinand, he was the main reason I was interested in seeing this movie, which marks his live-action feature directing debut. To prepare for the film, I read the book for the first time. Yes, surprisingly enough, I never came across it in my childhood, but it's clear why Johnson's story and illustrations left an impact, as there's a ton of imagination in these pages. The book is a very quick read, so how does it translate into a 90-minute feature film? Well, for starters, the book mainly serves as a jumping-off point for Harold and his friends in the adventure they go on. The movie actually wastes no time in bringing them to the real world, as barely a few minutes into the film, Harold is drawing the door that takes them there. I would have liked to spend a bit more time in the crayon world, as the hand-drawn animation has a lot of charm to it, and owing to Saldanha's animation background, there are quite a few amusing gags. They do a nice job of realizing the world as depicted in Johnson's book. The story becomes a bit of a meta-narrative involving the book and how authors create their characters, who eventually take on a life of their own through the reader's imagination, or the filmmaker's imagination in this case. While the film takes some major departures from the book, it does incorporate a few elements, even when out in the real world. I think the movie is at its strongest when it shows Harold using his crayon to create things out of thin air, with a visual effects artist following suit. The film itself throws a lot at you, with several little storylines going on. Harold and his moose friend, the porcupine, a young boy they meet, his mother, and a librarian all have their own subplots that the film attempts to juggle. When Harold jumps into our world, it starts off as a fish-out-of-water story, and then becomes something surprisingly existential as he looks for his creator. The boy Mel is bullied at school, the mother hates her job, the porcupine becomes a fugitive, and a librarian who serves as the villain wants his fantasy book published and attempts to use the crayon for his own purposes. I kind of wish the movie had picked a plotline or two and focused on that, as there's so much going on that it crams into 90 minutes. There are scenes that mainly exist as little comedic episodes, like Harold and Moose working in a bargain store, but while there are some amusing moments, I felt the film could have been funnier. I also had a few questions about certain things. For example, why do the moose and porcupine turn into humans when they enter the real world? The film never really offers an explanation for this. There are a few moments where he even turns back into a moose when he's scared. Again, why? The actors do appear to be enjoying themselves in these roles and provide a decent amount of energy. Zachary Levi is basically doing a slight variation of what he did in the Shazam movies, and he does fine what's required of him. There are times when Harold gets a little goofy, but for the most part, Levi does not go too overboard and showcases his excitement in making these things come to life. Tanya Reynolds really digs into the role of Porcupine, which requires a lot of physicality on her part. She is surprisingly not in the film as much as one would expect, and is even separated from Harold and Moose for a good chunk of time. The standout of the cast is Jermaine Clement as the librarian Gary. This is a very silly character, and he does lean into that, and while I don't think Harold and the Purple Crayon really necessitated a villain, he gets a few amusing one-liners, and I didn't mind his presence. The movie is essentially about the power of imagination and creativity, which is kind of needed in times like this. We keep seeing the usage of AI art, and I personally don't find any of those regenerated images to be the least bit compelling or interesting to look at. This movie celebrates the importance of people in creating art and ideas. AI can never create a book like Harold and the Purple Crayon, which could only be made from Crockett Johnson's pure, unfiltered imagination. And throughout this film, we see Harold, Gary, and Mel draw these creatures and objects. At no point do they just type a few things on a computer and let that do the work. Let's just say Harold and the Purple AI app will be a very boring book. Overall, I found this movie to be a harmless enough family film that provides some okay entertainment through its runtime. I do wish the story had a bit more focus to it, and maybe could have spent more time in the animated world before it rushed off to the real world. But it's not without its moments, and there is some of the energy that was also prevalent in Carlos Saldanha's movies at Blue Sky Studios. He's a director whose films I'll always look forward to. He looks set to continue in the live-action world as he's back in his native Brazil working on his next movie, 100 Days, about the first person to row across the South Atlantic, and I'll be curious to see how that turns out.